Will you join with me in prayer? Gracious and loving God, may the meditations and the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable unto you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I'd like to start this morning by taking a poll. How many of you had to sit at the children's table this past Thursday? Show me, I want to see your hands. None? There's no children's table anymore? Okay, one. Sorry. Only one person had to sit at the children's table? Okay, there we go. I'm with you. How many of you have ever had to sit at the children's table? Let's see. All right. I remember being pretty young and feeling quite jealous that I still had to sit at the children's table. I wanted to sit with the adults because that meant meant that I could spend time with my older cousins, who I idolized. You see, I was somewhat stuck in the middle. I was the youngest of the first cousins, so I was still in grade school when all of my aunt's kids started having children of their own. But by the time I was in middle school, I was the go-to babysitter for any family gathering, which meant that I was always relegated to sit at the children's table. So when I entered high school, I decided that I was done with the kiddies. And I started scheming to carve out a space for myself at the adult table. And freshman year Thanksgiving, I finally succeeded. I gained acceptance at a table where I'd previously been denied. And it turns out that sitting with the adults was really boring. And I actually preferred sitting at the kids' table. It reminds me that while I was gaining acceptance and stature at the family table, things were a bit different at school. Welcome to the loser lounge, read the sign that was duct taped to my regular table at the high school cafeteria. I stopped in my tracks. My jaw dropped, my palms began to sweat, and I seriously considered eating my lunch in the bathroom. Was I a loser? In my mind, freshman year was going great. I was able to balance all of my school activities with sports and youth group and time to hang with my friends, and I even had time to run for student government. So in my mind, I might have been, dare I say it, one of the popular kids? But here it was, simple Sharpie marker on poster board, big and bold for all to see, the loser lounge. As I stood there, shocked, mouth open, and suffering from paralysis, an amazing and beautiful thing occurred. My sister, Amy, a senior at the time, captain of the cheerleading squad, and all-around goddess of Upper St. Clair High School, swooped in, tore down the sign, and shoved it in the garbage. And she looked at me and said something to the effect, like, oh my gosh, just sit down and eat already. Which my loser friends and I quickly did, because the queen of the school had ordained it. Later, I heard my sister getting dressed down by the other members of the cheerleading squad as we waited after school for my mom to pick us up. Apparently, they had been the masterminds behind the poster. My sister broke ranks with what was popular and defied her own in-crowd to protect me and to protect my friends. But her small act of kindness was a turning point in our relationship. Now that I look at it, it all sounds like an episode of the popular TV series Glee. We'd never actually been close before we were in high school together, but now, and even into adulthood, we are inseparable. And I know that seems like a small deal in the grand scheme of life, but my sister performed an act of justice for me that day. It was more caring and more risky than one can imagine. It upset the delicate balance that permeates the teenage social strata. She made someone who was deemed unacceptable and a loser acceptable, and in the process, she healed a broken relationship. Through my work in my high school youth group and into my college and seminary years, I began to serve people who'd been denied different places at different tables. I'd served the homeless and the poor, worked with victims of domestic violence, done disaster relief ministry, was a straight supporter of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and questioning community, and worked towards open ordination for all. However, And it wasn't until much later that I experienced that denial for myself. We are collectively drawn to the story of the Gospel of Luke because at some point in time, we have all been othered. We have all been denied a place at a table of one or another. There have been times when we've lost, times when we've failed, times when we've hurt the ones who love us the most, and times when we've not been able to admit that we were wrong, times that we've felt superior or inferior. We have all had moments of weeping at Jesus' feet. For me, it was losing our second son. I was blessed to have a healthy son when Sammy was born and was thrilled to discover that I was pregnant again. We so wanted another child, and we wanted them close together in age. The pregnancy was not easy from the start, and I never anticipated it ending the way that it did. But when it was over and we had lost our son, I felt robbed. I felt angry. I felt denied my place at the table as a mother and as a woman. I felt like a failure, even though there was nothing I could have done to change the outcome of the situation. Naturally, I was brought very low. I was even at times depressed. And eventually, I found myself kneeling at Jesus' feet, not unlike the woman with the ointment. I prayed that if God would get me through this hurt and loss, I would be a better mother and a better partner to John. And God heard my prayers because he gave me another chance. But in the process, he reminded me that I was not the only woman who had ever suffered in this regard. Sharing my story has opened the door for other women to share with me their stories of joys and loss in motherhood. And all of this has reminded me that even when we feel we are denied a place at one table, a seat at another is being prepared for our presence. All of you know that I have a new man in my life. My little Simon is a total joy, and I am blessed beyond measure that he is here and that he is healthy. He truly rounds out our little family. It is no accident that his name is Simon. The name Simon, or Shimon in Hebrew, or Simeon in Greek, means literally, he who has heard, or he who listens. I chose the name Simon because God heard my prayers and forgave me of my sins of anger and had compassion on me, much the same as Jesus had compassion on this unnamed woman. In the Gospel of Luke, at the home of Simon the leper, who was a Pharisee, we witness an incredibly intimate and humble act. The woman with the ointment had to be so brave to approach Jesus and kneel at his feet. You see, these banquets were public affairs and were often very crowded. And at this point, Jesus was something of a celebrity, so many people were there to watch him. And she knew that this community was very aware of her public sins. But she humbled herself to approach Jesus. And if washing Christ's feet with her tears and then drying them with her hair wasn't intimate and extravagant enough, she goes on to take her most prized possession, the spikenard ointment, to cool and to soothe Jesus' head and feet. She offered him this kindness when his own host denied him these common customs. Jesus knew who he was dealing with as he approached the house of Simon the Pharisee. You see, the Pharisees were a Jewish sect noted for their strict observance of rites and ceremonies of the written law. They were also known for their insistence on the validity of their own oral traditions concerning the law. The Pharisees were a self-righteous and unjust group, and they didn't treat those who believed differently very kindly. Jesus called them hypocrites because they talked about strict adherence to the law, but they failed to practice what they preached. So when Jesus came into the courtyard of Simon's home, and Simon greeted him, but did not give Jesus some of the expected courtesies, he wasn't surprised. You see, normally when a guest arrived in your home during Jesus' time, you would embrace them, you would hug them, you would touch them in some friendly way. But this Pharisee did none of these. And when Jesus came in, Simon should have offered Jesus some water with which to bathe his feet, or have had a servant bathe his feet. Simon should have offered olive oil to soothe his hands and feet, which would have been tired from all the travel. But Simon did not offer him olive oil. So there was a coolness from Simon towards Jesus. Soon there was an uninvited guest on the scene, someone who had no place at the table with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees believed that she had no place at the table with someone they considered to be a prophet. A known prostitute comes in and kneels at Christ's feet. She kneels and she begins crying. And she cries so much that her tears actually wet Jesus' feet. I know I have cried that hard. And she takes her hair, which would have been braided conservatively around her head, her long dark hair, and she unbraids it and lets it down, which is a public no-no. And she starts to wash Jesus' feet with her tears and hair. People were stunned. People were speechless. No one knew what to say. This woman was doing something which was very improper, letting her hair down like that in public, crying her tears over Jesus' feet. It was all improper. It violated the rules of civil etiquette. And then, to make matters worse, she starts kissing his feet. How strange it all seemed. But not so strange to a people who understood that in Jewish custom, if someone saved your life, you would come to that person and kiss their feet. So that she was kissing Jesus' feet implies and reveals that she believed that Jesus could rescue her and could save her from her sin. This story contains not only intimacy, but extravagance. The perfumed ointment was expensive, and in a moment's use, it was gone. The story contains not only intimacy and extravagance, but also grace. The act of giving, which requires nothing, is dependent on nothing, and asks for nothing in return. Intimacy, extravagance, and grace all catch our attention when we see them happen. We remember them because they are out of the ordinary. So where do we see God in this story? God is present in and reaches out to us from every one of these characters, because together they represent the struggles of the early Christian church to be faithful to God. And all of the characters in the stories mediate God to us. In this story, we see God as a receiver. We meet God in the one who receives this woman's gifts, Jesus, the second in the Trinity. Also, God is an objector. We meet God in the one who object to this woman's gift, the Pharisees. In the Pharisee, we meet a God who knows and demands of us right and wrong. We're uncomfortable with such a God because in the presence of God's unending light, we see the darkness in our own lives. It's more comfortable to associate righteousness with a Pharisee who isn't to be taken seriously because he's a hypocrite. But behind that, there is a God of right and wrong with whom we must make peace. And in the disciples, we meet a God who delights when his people are creators of justice. Anyone who has compassion on the poor, the outcast, and the lonely represent an essential part of God's nature. And again, we are uncomfortable with such a God because we don't really want to believe that those who society sees as other have a special place in God's heart. We don't always want to order our own lives or our own societies that would bring justice to these individuals and groups. But of the greatest importance, we see in this story God as a giver. In the woman with the ointment, we meet God as the one who gives. In the story of the ointment poured at Jesus' feet and dried with a woman's hair, we see that God's giving is not measured, but boundless, not reasoned, but spontaneous, not cautious, but abandoned. And in the sacrament of communion, we model the God that we meet in the woman with the ointment, a God who nurtures and nourishes, a God who feeds us out of all that God is, and a God who calls us to model nurturing to each other. The woman is the only one in the passage who sees Jesus for who Jesus really is. If we look at the parallel stories in the other Gospels, they mention that her pouring of ointment on Jesus was akin to preparing his body for burial. She knew what trials he would face, and she knew that he would save her. She acts on that understanding and does the very best best she can to manifest her faith and love by offering Jesus some small human comfort. By helping him prepare for the worst ordeal imaginable, the woman has earned not only Jesus' support and gratitude, but also immortality. And in short, she's a paragon for all humankind. For me, the key to the story is one line. Jesus turned to Simon and, revealing his key point, says, "Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little." So what does it mean to hunger and thirst for justice? Those who hunger and thirst for justice have a deep yearning for things to be right in their individual lives and in society. This will happen when God's kingdom comes completely and creation is restored to its original intention. And in the meanwhile, we yearn for God's justice to be present in our fallen world. And to the extent that we are able, we seek to live according to God's standard of justice and to see his justice experienced in our world. Wherever we have authority, at work and in our families, in government or in church, we should live out the biblical call to justice so that we can all help provide everyone with a place at the table.